The chains bit into her wrist so deeply that the skin beneath had stopped bleeding days ago, replaced by a dull, infected throb that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. Alara knelt on the stone floor of the cellar, her bare knees pressed against cold that seeped upward through her bones, to her thin cotton shift, to what remained of her will. She opened her mouth to scream the way she did every morning when the pain first woke her, but no sound came out. No sound ever came out. She had been mute since birth, and her stepfamily had long ago decided that a voiceless Omega was no Omega at all, but something less, something closer to furniture, something you could chain in a cellar and forget. Above her head, the floorboards groaned with footsteps. Laughter filtered down through the cracks, bright and careless. She could smell breakfast, bacon fat, and fresh bread and coffee, and her stomach clenched so violently that she doubled over, the chains rattling against the iron ring bolted into the wall. She had not eaten in 3 days. The last thing they had given her was a bowl of cold water with a crust of stale bread floating in it, and her stepsister Vivienne had laughed as she slid it across the floor like feeding a dog. The cellar door opened. Light fell down the stairs in a sharp, painful wedge, and Alara flinched, turning her face away. She heard the click of heels, slow and deliberate, and the smell of jasmine perfume cut through the damp and mold. Her stepmother, Margot, descended halfway and stopped. She never came all the way down. She never needed to. Look at me when I speak to you. Alara raised her head. Her eyes, pale gray and too large for her thin face, found Margot standing on the 5th step in a cream silk dress, her auburn hair swept into a perfect chignon. Behind her, just visible at the top of the stairs, Vivienne leaned against the door frame, arms crossed, smiling. "The royal selection is tomorrow," Margot said, examining her nails. "Every eligible female in the territory has been summoned to the Grand Hall. King Kyle will choose his bride." Alara knew this. Everyone knew this. The Alpha King had ruled the 5 territories for 7 years without a Luna, and the Council of Elders had finally demanded he take a mate. Rumors said his wolf had grown unstable. Rumors said he had killed 3 challengers in a single moon cycle, and that his eyes stayed gold for hours after each fight. The pack needed a Luna to anchor him, and every unmated female between 18 and 25 had been ordered to attend, including, technically, Alara. Margot seemed to read the thought in her eyes. "You will not be going." Alara did not react. She had learned years ago that reacting only made things worse. Vivienne will attend in her finest gown. She is everything a Luna should be. Strong, beautiful, a voice that commands attention. Margot smiled at the cruelty of her own words. "And you, little mouse, will stay exactly where you are. If anyone from the census asks, you died of fever last winter. I filed the paperwork myself." She turned to go, then paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "Oh, and I have tightened your chains. The inspection team sometimes checks cellars during royal events. Best if you cannot reach the door." The heels clicked back up the stairs. Vivienne lingered a moment longer, tilting her head as if studying something mildly interesting. Then she pulled her phone from her pocket and snapped a photo of Alara, chains and filth and all. "For memories," Vivienne said sweetly, and closed the door. Darkness swallowed the cellar whole. Alara sat in it and breathed. She breathed in the mold and the damp and the iron smell of her own dried blood, and she breathed out something that was not quite despair, because despair required surrender, and Alara had never surrendered. Not when her father died and Margot inherited everything. Not when Vivienne burned Alara's only photograph of her mother in front of her face. Not when the pack doctor, paid off by Margot, had told the registration office that Alara's muteness was a sign of a defective wolf, rendering her essentially rank-less. She was not rankless. She could feel her wolf inside her, curled tight and small, but burning, always burning, a warmth that no amount of cold stone could extinguish. Her wolf had never spoken to her in words the way other wolves apparently spoke to their human halves, but it communicated in other ways. In warmth when she was freezing. In a low, vibrating hum against her ribs when danger was close. In dreams filled with moonlight and running, always running through silver forests toward something she could never quite reach. Tonight, the wolf stirred. It had been quiet for weeks, conserving energy as Alara's body slowly starved. But now it pressed against her chest from the inside, and the hum was louder than she had ever felt it, almost frantic, almost urgent, as if it sensed something coming that Alara could not yet see. She closed her eyes and pressed her forehead to her chained wrists. Something was coming. She did not know what. The morning of the royal selection dawned gray and cold over the Blackmoor territory. Frost laced the windows of the packhouse, and the courtyard filled early with the rumble of engines and the sharp, competing sense of perfume and anxiety. Females from every rank arrived in their best dresses, flanked by ambitious mothers and nervous fathers. Omegas came in modest clothes, heads down, knowing they were there only to fulfill the census requirement. Betas came with cautious hope, and the daughters of high-ranking families came like weapons, sharpened and polished and aimed directly at the throne. Vivienne arrived in a gown of deep emerald that hugged her curves and left her shoulders bare. Her dark hair cascaded in waves, and her lips were painted the exact shade of blood. Margot walked beside her in charcoal silk, nodding graciously to the other families, playing the role of proud and humble mother with the precision of a woman who had practiced the performance for years. No one asked about the other daughter, the one who could not speak, the one who, according to official records, had died of fever 8 months ago. No one except a small, quiet woman at the registration table who frowned at her tablet, scrolled through census data, and made a note. Inside the grand hall, 300 females stood in curved rows before a raised platform draped in black and silver. The air smelled of cedar and cold stone, and the faint electric charge that preceded a thunderstorm. At the edges of the hall, the king's personal guard stood in formation, 12 wolves in human form, each one radiating enough dominance that the Omegas in the front rows trembled. And then the doors behind the platform opened, and the trembling spread to everyone. King Kyle Draven entered the hall like a shadow given form. He was tall, broader across the shoulders than any wolf Alara's territory had ever produced, his dark hair cut close at the sides and longer on top, falling across a forehead marked by a thin scar that ran from his left temple into his hairline. His jaw was hard, his cheekbones sharp, and his eyes were the color of hammer gold, wolf eyes that had not fully receded to human brown in what appeared to be a very long time. He wore black from collar to boot, no crown, no regalia, because a wolf who could make 300 people stop breathing simply by walking into a room did not need ornamentation. His beta, a tall red-haired man named Ronan, walked 2 steps behind him, carrying a leather folio. His gamma, a scarred woman named Sierra, took position at the edge of the platform, her eyes scanning the crowd with the cold efficiency of someone cataloging threats. Cale did not sit in the ornate chair that had been prepared for him. He stood at the edge of the platform and looked out over the assembled females, and his expression held nothing. Not interest, not contempt, not hope. Nothing. Because Cale Dravon had stopped hoping 7 years ago, when his first mate, a gentle beta named Lena, had been murdered by a rival pack during a border raid. He had felt the bond snap like a wire through his chest, and he had shifted and run for 3 days without stopping, and when he finally came back to human form, he was standing in a field of bodies, the rival pack's entire war party, and he was covered in blood that was not his own. His wolf had never fully retreated after that. It sat behind his eyes, watching, waiting, feral with grief. The council wanted him to take a new mate. His wolf wanted only one thing, and it was something that no longer existed in the world. Or so he believed. "Let us begin," Ronan said, his voice carrying across the silent hall. "Each female will approach the platform, state her name and rank, and present herself to the king. By tradition, the king's wolf will respond to the presence of a fated mate. If no fated bond is detected, the king will choose from among the candidates based on alliance value and compatibility. One by one, they came forward. Betas, with steady gazes, high-born Omegas with careful poise, Alphas' daughters with barely concealed ambition. Each one stepped onto the platform, stated her name, and stood under the golden weight of Cale's stare. Nothing, His wolf stirred for none of them. Not a flicker, not a twitch, not the faintest whisper of recognition. Vivian's turn came 40 minutes in. She climbed the steps with practiced grace, her emerald gown catching the light, and she smiled at Kyle with a warmth that was convincing enough to fool nearly everyone in the room. "Vivian Ashford," she said, her voice clear and melodic. "Beta rank, daughter of the Ashford line. I have studied pack governance and diplomacy since childhood. I would be honored to serve as your Luna." She held his gaze without flinching, which was more than most had managed. Margot, standing in the crowd, pressed her hands together in something that looked like prayer. Cale studied Vivian for 3 seconds. His wolf yawned. "Next," he said. Vivian's smile did not waver as she descended the steps, but her hands shook and a flush of humiliation crept up her neck. Margot caught her arm as she returned to the crowd, whispered something sharp in her ear, and Vivian's expression hardened into stone. The line continued. 90 females. 100. 150. Cale's expression grew darker with each one, the gold in his eyes intensifying, and Ronan exchanged a worried glance with Sarah. If the king found no mate today, the council would push for a political match. And a political match to an alpha whose wolf was already feral was a disaster waiting to happen. At 2:12, Kyle raised his hand. "Enough." The hall went silent. "There is no one here," he said, and his voice was low and rough, the voice of a man whose wolf was very close to the surface. "The bond does not recognize any of them." Ronan stepped forward. "Your Majesty, there are still 88 candidates remaining." I said enough, but it was at that exact moment that the small, quiet woman from the registration table appeared at the side door of the grand hall. She caught Ronan's eye, beckoned urgently, and held up her tablet. Ronan hesitated. Then he crossed to her, leaned down, and read what was on the screen. His eyebrows rose. He took the tablet, scrolled, read something else, and his eyebrows rose further. He returned to Kyle. "There is a discrepancy in the census, Your Majesty. The Ashford household registered 2 daughters. One is present, the other was reported deceased 8 months ago, but the death certificate was filed by the stepmother, not a licensed physician, and the body was never verified by pack officials." Cale's golden eyes shifted to Ronan. Something moved behind them, something alert and predatory and newly interested. "A missing daughter. A missing Omega daughter, Your Majesty. Age 22, registered mute from birth. Named Alara." Across the hall, Margot's face went white. Cale was already moving. He stepped down from the platform, and the crowd parted for him like water, pressing back against the walls as 300 females and their families tried to get out of the path of a wolf king whose eyes had gone fully gold. "Ronan, the Ashford estate. Now, Your Majesty, the inspection teams can handle. I will go myself." Something in the way he said it made Ronan stop arguing. It was not a command from a king to his beta. It was something more primal than that. Something that came from the wolf, not the man. And Ronan had served Cale long enough to know the difference. They moved fast. 3 black vehicles tore through the gray streets of Blackmore, past the shops and row houses, and out toward the estates at the territory's edge. Cale sat in the back of the lead vehicle, perfectly still, but his hands gripped his knees hard enough that the leather of his gloves creaked. His wolf was doing something it had not done in 7 years. It was pacing. It was pushing against his ribs. It was whining, high and desperate, like a creature scenting something on the wind that it had been searching for its entire existence. He did not understand it. He did not trust it. But he could not make it stop. The Ashford estate was a sprawling stone manor surrounded by old-growth pines, handsome and well-kept on the outside, the kind of house that photographs well for Pack Society newsletters. Cale's vehicles came to a stop in the circular drive, and he was out before Ronan could open his door. The front door was locked. Cale did not knock. He put his hand flat against the oak and pushed, and the lock shattered, and the door swung inward so hard it cracked the plaster of the wall behind it. The entryway was warm, well-furnished, smelling of lemon polish and fresh flowers. A family home, a comfortable home. Cale stood in it and breathed, and his wolf went insane. The scent hit him like a physical blow, buckled his knees, sent black spots swimming across his vision. It was faint, threaded with pain and sickness and starvation, buried under layers of damp stone and old iron, but it was there, unmistakable, undeniable, the single most beautiful thing he had ever smelled in his life. Snow and wild honey, and something that burned like starlight, something that reached into the hollow place behind his ribs, where the bond with Lena had once lived, and filled it with a warmth, so sudden and so fierce that he staggered. Mate, the word detonated in his skull with his wolf's voice, a voice he had not heard clearly in 7 years, a voice that was now roaring with a force that shook his entire body. Mate, 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 mate. Where, Cale said, and his voice was not his own. It was deeper, rougher, vibrating with a harmonic that made Ronan take a step back. The scent leads down, Sarah said, already moving through the house with her hand on her weapon. Basement level. They found the cellar door bolted from the outside. 3 deadbolts and a padlock. Cale ripped the padlock off with his bare hand, tearing the metal hasp out of the wood, and kicked the bolts free, and the door crashed open, and the smell hit him full force now, mixed with blood and infection and starvation, and his wolf howled inside his chest with a sound of such fury and such anguish that for a moment Cale could not see through the gold that flooded his vision. He went down the stairs. Ronan tried to follow. Sarah put her arm out and stopped him. Not now, she said quietly. Do not go near him right now. At the bottom of the stairs, in the dark, in the cold, in the filth and the chains, Alara heard footsteps. Heavy footsteps, not the click of Margot's heels, not the light, mocking tread of Vivian. Something else, something that made the stone floor vibrate beneath her knees. Her wolf exploded inside her chest. It was the only word for it. The small, quiet flame that had kept her alive through years of starvation and darkness and silence suddenly erupted into a blaze so violent that Alara gasped soundlessly, her back arching, her chained hands flying to her sternum, as if she could press the fire back down. Her wolf was screaming, howling, throwing itself against the inside of her ribs with a joy so desperate it was indistinguishable from pain. And then she smelled him. Pine and thunderstorms and iron and something underneath all of it, something ancient and wild. Like standing at the edge of a cliff in a windstorm, like the moment before lightning strikes. It filled her lungs, it filled her blood. It filled every starving, hollow, broken place inside her, and for the first time in her life, Alara's wolf spoke to her in a word. Mate. A shape filled the base of the stairs. Enormous, blocking the wedge of light from above. She could not see his face, only his silhouette and the 2 points of burning gold where his eyes were. He saw her. He saw the chains, the blood, the filth, the bones visible through the thin cotton of her shift, the infected skin around her wrists where iron had ground into flesh for months, the hollow cheeks, the cracked lips, the gray eyes, too large, too bright, staring up at him with an expression that was not fear, not hope, but something between the two that had no name. Something cracked inside Cale Dravone. Not broke. Cracked the way a dam cracks before the flood, the way the earth cracks before the eruption, the way a wolf king who has spent 7 years in controlled, calculated, frozen grief finally encounters the one thing that melts every wall he has built. He crossed the cellar in 2 strides and dropped to his knees in front of her. His hands found the chains, and he did not look for a key. He closed his fists around the links and pulled, and the metal shrieked, and the chain snapped, and then the other one, and the iron ring tore from the wall in a shower of stone dust. Alara's hands fell free. She stared at them, at the raw weeping circles around her wrists, and then she stared at the man kneeling in the filth in front of her. This enormous, terrifying man with wolf gold eyes and a jaw clenched so tight the muscles stood out like cords, and she did not understand what was happening. He reached for her face. His hand was shaking. This man who had killed armies, whose name made entire territories go quiet, whose wolf had not trembled for any living thing in 7 years. His hand was shaking as he cupped her cheek. "Who did this to you?" he said. It was not a question, it was the sound of something being loaded. Alara opened her mouth, closed it. opened it again. She could not speak. She had never been able to speak. She could only stare at him with those gray eyes that were filling with tears for the first time in years, because she had forgotten what it felt like to be touched without pain. Kyle saw her try to speak, saw her fail, saw the humiliation flicker across her face, the instinctive flinch, as if she expected him to recoil from her defect, the way everyone always had. He did not recoil. He leaned closer, and his wolf settled into a low, rumbling growl that was not fret, but promise, not anger, but claiming, the sound a wolf makes when it has found the thing it would die for and will never ever let go. "You do not need to speak," he said. "I hear you." He gathered her into his arms. She weighed nothing. She should have weighed nothing to a man of his size regardless, but this was different. This was the weight of a body that had been systematically starved, and the rage that detonated inside him was so vast and so total that for a moment the house above them shuddered, every window on the ground floor cracking simultaneously as his dominance flared outward in an uncontrolled wave that sent Ronan and Sarah stumbling back and made every wolf within a half-mile radius drop to their knees. He carried her up the stairs. Ronan saw the girl in his arms, saw her condition, and his face went pale. Sarah's hand tightened on her weapon, and she looked around the immaculate house with new eyes, seeing it now for what it was, a beautiful cage built around a hidden atrocity. "The stepmother and stepsister," Cale said, walking through the foyer with Alara held against his chest, her face buried in his neck, her tears soaking into the collar of his black shirt. "Arrest them, now! Bring them to the Grand Hall in chains. Your Majesty, in chains, Ronan." He carried her out of the house and into the gray morning light. And Alara flinched against the brightness and pressed closer to him, and his wolf hummed against his ribs with a sound she could feel through his chest, a vibration that resonated with something inside her own body, a frequency that matched, that harmonized, that completed. In the back of the vehicle, he held her. He would not put her down. Ronan drove and Sarah rode in the passenger seat with a medkit trying to tend to Alara's wrists, but every time she reached for the girl, Cale's wolf snarled through his throat and his arms tightened. "Cale," Sarah said carefully, using his name, not his title, because they had known each other since childhood. "She needs medical attention. Her wrists are infected. She is severely malnourished." The gold in his eyes flickered. The man fought the wolf for control. Slowly, with visible effort, he loosened his grip enough for Seer to clean and wrap Alara's wrists with gentle, efficient hands. Alara watched Sarah work. She did not wince even when the antiseptic burned. She was used to pain. What she was not used to was someone treating her pain as if it mattered. She looked up at Cale. He was already looking at her. She raised her hand and touched his jaw, very lightly with her fingertips. "A question. Who are you? Why are you here? Why do you look at me like that?" "I am Cale Dravan," he said, "Alpha King of the 5 territories. And you are my mate." Her hand dropped. Her eyes widened. She shook her head, a small frantic motion, and the fear that crossed her face was not fear of him, but fear of something much worse, the fear of being offered something beautiful and having it taken away, the way everything beautiful had always been taken from her. He caught her hand before she could pull it back. Held it. His thumb traced the inside of her wrist above the bandage where her pulse hammered. "I know you cannot speak," he said, "but your wolf is speaking to mine, and mine is answering. That has not happened in 7 years. I will not let you go, not now, not ever." She stared at him, and then slowly, so slowly, her fingers curled around his and she held on. They arrived at the Grand Hall, to chaos. Word had spread faster than the vehicles could drive. The Alpha King had found his fated mate. The Alpha King had found her in chains. The Alpha King was bringing her back to the selection. The Alpha King's eyes had not stopped glowing gold since he left the Ashford estate. 300 females and their families were still in the hall, buzzing with whispers and rumors and the sharp, anxious scent of disrupted expectations. When the doors opened and Kay walked in carrying a girl who looked like a ghost, thin as wire, wrapped in his coat, her wrists bandaged and her bare feet dangling. The hall went so silent that you could hear the flags moving in the draft from the open doors. He walked to the platform. He climbed the steps. He did not put her down. He turned to face the hall, and when he spoke, his voice carried to every corner with a resonance that was not human, the voice of a wolf speaking through a man's throat, layered with the harmonic frequency of an alpha command that made every wolf in the room go still. This is Alara. She is my fated mate. She is your future Luna. A murmur began and died as his eyes swept the crowd. She was held in chains by her own family. Starved, imprisoned, reported dead to avoid the census. She is mute, not broken. She is Omega, not weak. She is mine, and she is yours, and any wolf who questions her worth will answer to me. He paused. Bring them in. The side doors opened. Sarah and two guards entered, and between them, in iron cuffs that clicked against the stone floor, walked Margot and Vivian Ashford. Margot had not yet fully processed what was happening. Her face shifted between calculation and terror, searching for an angle, a story, an explanation that might save her. Vivian was crying, mascara streaking her cheeks, the emerald gown suddenly looking garish and absurd against the iron at her wrists. Cale looked at them, just looked, and Margot's knees buckled. She dropped to the floor under the sheer weight of his dominance, and Vivian crumpled beside her, and the entire hall watched the woman who had chained an Omega in a cellar kneel before the Alpha King who had chosen that Omega as his bride. You will stand trial before the Pack Council, Cale said. The charges are imprisonment, abuse, falsification of death records, and violation of the Omega Protection Accords. Until your trial, you will be held in the cells beneath this hall. He looked at Margot. The same cells where you kept her. Fitting, I think. Margot opened her mouth to protest, and Sarah's hand closed on her shoulder with enough force to silence her. The guards dragged them both from the hall, and the last thing Vivian saw before the doors closed was Alara, cradled in the arms of the most powerful wolf alive, looking down at her with gray eyes that held no hatred, no triumph, nothing but quiet, exhausted relief. The first days were hard. Alara was installed in the Luna's chambers at the palace, a suite of rooms larger than the entire Ashford house, with windows that looked out over the Blackmoor Valley, and a bed so vast and soft that she lay in the center of it the first night and could not sleep, because her body had forgotten what comfort felt like and interpreted softness as threat. The pack physician, a gentle old beta named Dr. Both, Hale examined her and delivered his report to Cale with the careful diplomacy of a man who understood that giving this particular alpha bad news about this particular patient could result in structural damage to the room. Severe malnutrition, muscle wasting. The wrist infections are responding to treatment, but will scar. She has 2 cracked ribs that healed incorrectly, likely from a beating several months ago. Her wolf is intact, but suppressed, probably from the prolonged starvation. With proper nutrition and care, she should make a full physical recovery within 2 to 3 months. Cale stood at the window with his back to the doctor, his hands clasped behind him, very still. And her voice, the muteness is congenital, Your Majesty. It is not a result of the abuse. Her vocal cords are malformed. She will never speak. The silence that followed was so heavy that Dr. Hale edged toward the door. She has functional hearing, he added carefully. She can read and write fluently. Her cognitive function is excellent. The muteness does not diminish. I know what it does not diminish, Cale said quietly. Leave the treatment plan. I will see to her care personally. And he did. The Alpha King of the 5 territories, a man who had conquered border wars and negotiated treaties and reduced hostile packs to rubble, personally oversaw the feeding schedule of a 22-year-old Omega. He sat with her at meals, watching her eat with a focus that would have been unsettling if it were not so transparently driven by the terror that she was still not eating enough. He had a tablet brought to her room with a writing application so she could communicate, and he read every word she typed with the same intensity he brought to intelligence reports. She wrote simple things at first. Thank you. The food is good. I do not need so many blankets. He responded to each message as if it were a matter of state importance. It was during the first week that Alara discovered two things. The first was that the palace was full of wolves who did not know what to make of her. The staff whispered when she passed, not cruelly but curiously, and the courtiers watched from a distance, evaluating, calculating, trying to determine whether this silent skeletal Omega was an asset or a liability to their king. She recognized the looks. She had seen them her entire life, the quick up and down assessment, the moment of dismissal. The second thing she discovered was that she was not Kale's only complication. Her name was Celine. Celine Croft was the daughter of the Croft pack, one of the most powerful families in the 5 territories. She was beautiful in the way that weapons are beautiful, all sleek lines and cold edges, with dark hair that fell to her waist and green eyes that could charm or cut with equal precision. She had been Kale's chosen companion for the past 2 years, a political arrangement that everyone in the court understood to be a precursor to a formal mating. She was not his fated mate. She did not need to be. She was powerful, connected, and she had spent 2 years positioning herself as the inevitable Luna. And then Kale had walked into the grand hall carrying a mute, starved Omega in his arms, and announced her as his fated mate, and Celine's carefully constructed future had collapsed in approximately 45 seconds. Alara met her on the 3rd day. She was walking through the palace garden, wrapped in a cashmere shawl that Kale had sent to her room, along with an entire wardrobe of clothes, in soft fabrics, when Celine appeared on the path ahead of her, flanked by 2 of her friends from the court. "So you're the little Omega everyone is talking about," Celine said. Her voice was pleasant, her smile warm, and her eyes were absolutely empty of anything resembling warmth. Alara stopped. She held her tablet against her chest and looked at Celine the way she had looked at Margot for years, with careful, watchful stillness. "They say you cannot speak. Is that true?" Alara nodded. "How unfortunate. Aluna must address the pack. She must give speeches, negotiate with other territories, mediate disputes. Tell me, how do you plan to do any of that?" Alara said nothing because she could not, and they both knew it, and the cruelty was in the asking. Celine stepped closer. Her scent was sharp, citrus, and something metallic, and underneath it there was something else, something that made Alara's wolf flatten its ears. "He will grow tired of you," Celine said, still smiling. "The bond is new, and new bonds are intense. But intensity fades, and what will be left? A silent girl who cannot lead, cannot command, cannot even tell her king that she loves him. You are a novelty. I am a necessity." She reached out and touched Alara's cheek, a mirror of the gesture Kale had made in the cellar, except where his touch had been trembling and reverent, Celine's was cold and precise. "Enjoy it while it lasts, little mouse, little mouse." She left. Her friends followed. Alara stood in the garden for a long time, the wind pulling at her shawl, and then she walked back to her room and sat on the edge of the enormous bed and did not cry, because Margot had beaten the crying out of her years ago, but she pressed her hands to her face and shook, and her wolf whined low and thin inside her chest. She did not tell Kyle. She did not need to. He smelled it on her when he came to check on her that evening. Not Celine's scent specifically, but the sour, unmistakable smell of distress, and his wolf went rigid behind his eyes. "What happened?" he said. She shook her head and picked up her tablet. "Nothing. I am just tired." He looked at the words. He looked at her face. He did not believe her, and they both knew it, but he did not push. Instead, he sat down beside her on the bed, close enough that the heat of his body reached her through the space between them, and he said, "When I was 20, my first mate was killed." Alara looked at him. Her name was Lena. She was kind and quiet, and she loved rainstorms. A border pack attacked our territory during a summit. She was in the wrong place. I felt the bond break while I was in the middle of negotiating a trade agreement. I stood up from the table and shifted, and I did not stop killing until there was no one left to kill. His voice was even. His eyes were not. "For 7 years, my wolf has been silent. Not dormant. Silent. As if it was listening for something. Searching for something. I thought it was grief. I thought the silence was permanent." He turned to look at her. "And then I walked into your cellar, and my wolf spoke for the first time in 7 years, and it said one word." Alara's eyes were very bright. You do not need to tell me what happened today. You do not need to tell me anything until you are ready. But I need you to understand something. He took her hand, the same way he had in the car, his thumb tracing the skin above her bandage. Whatever voice told you that you are not enough, it lied. My wolf chose you. I choose you, and I am not a man who changes his mind. She pulled her hand free. He let her, though something flickered in his jaw. She picked up the tablet in tight for a long time, and when she turned it to show him, the screen read, I have been told my whole life that I am broken, that my silence is a defect, that no wolf would ever want an omega who cannot speak. I want to believe you, but believing is the most dangerous thing I know how to do. He read it twice. Then he looked at her and said, Then I will be patient, and I will be dangerous enough for both of us. 2 weeks passed. Alara healed. Her cheeks filled. Color returned to her skin. Dr. Hale adjusted her ribs, and the sharp pain that had been her constant companion for months faded to a manageable ache and then to nothing. She ate 3 meals a day, then 4, then 5, because Cale apparently believed that if a little food was good, an absurd amount of food was better, and she did not have the voice to argue, and did not particularly want to argue anyway, because the palace kitchen made a chocolate cake that she would have sold her soul for. She also began to explore the palace. The staff grew accustomed to the silent girl who appeared in doorways and hallways, and once, memorably, in the weapons room, studying a display of antique swords with the focused interest of someone who understood that being voiceless did not mean being powerless. It was during one of these explorations that she found the children. The palace maintained a nursery for the pups of staff members and lower-ranking pack wolves who worked within the compound. It was a bright, warm room full of toys and noise, overseen by a beta nursemaid named Clara, who was gentle and tired and managed a rotating cast of 12 to 15 pups between the ages of 2 and 6. Alara discovered it by accident, drawn by the sound of crying to a half-open door. She peered inside and saw Clara holding a screaming toddler in one arm while trying to prevent 2 4-year-olds from climbing a bookshelf with the other. Alara stepped in and caught the 4-year-olds before they reached the 3rd shelf. She set them gently on the floor, crouched to their eye level, and made a series of exaggerated faces that startled them so thoroughly they forgot about the bookshelf entirely. One of them laughed. The other stared at her with enormous brown eyes and then reached for her hair. Clara watched this with the expression of a woman being offered water in the desert. You are good with them, she said. Alara shrugged. She pointed to herself, then to the room, then held her hands up in a questioning gesture. You want help? Please! Please help, I am drowning. Alara smiled, and it was the first genuine smile she had worn since arriving at the palace, and it transformed her face entirely, turning the gaunt angles into something luminous and warm. She came back the next day, and the next, and every day after. The children did not care that she could not speak. Children operate on a different frequency than adults, and Alara communicated with them in a language that did not require words. She held them when they cried. She played elaborate silent games that involved more physical comedy than dialogue. She drew pictures on the chalkboard, intricate little stories told in images, a wolf and a moon and a tiny rabbit on an adventure, and the children sat in rapt attention and supplied the dialogue themselves, their small voices filling the silence she could not. There was one child in particular, a girl, barely 3, with a tangle of dark curls and wide gray eyes that were unnervingly similar to Alara's own. Her name was Mira, and she was the daughter of a pack soldier who had died in service 6 months earlier. Her mother had left the territory shortly after, unable to cope, and Mira had been absorbed into the nursery system, a quiet, solemn child who did not play with the others, and who had not spoken a word since her father's death. Alara recognized something in her. The quality of her silence was not empty but full, packed tight with things that could not be expressed, and Alara understood that kind of silence intimately. She did not push Mira. She simply sat near her every day, within arm's reach, but never touching, and drew pictures on a small notepad. Wolves, moons, stars, flowers, flowers. After a week, Mira scooted closer. After 2 weeks, Mira was leaning against Alara's side, watching her draw, and occasionally pointing at what she wanted Alara to draw next. After 3 weeks, Mira climbed into Alara's lap during nap time and fell asleep with her face pressed into Alara's neck, breathing in her scent, and Alara held her and rocked her and pressed her cheek against the dark curls and felt something inside her chest shift and settle into place, a piece of a puzzle she had not known she was assembling. Kael found out about the nursery visits from Clara, who mentioned it in passing to Ronan, who mentioned it to Kael. The king went to see for himself. He stood in the doorway of the nursery, unseen, and watched Alara sitting on the floor surrounded by children, her hands moving in the air as she told a story without words, the children laughing and shouting and filling in the blanks. And on her lap, Mira, quiet and content, clinging to Alara's shirt with one small fist. Something happened to Kael's face. Sarah, who had followed him, saw it and looked away, because it was the kind of expression that felt too private to witness, the expression of a man who had believed himself incapable of feeling anything beyond rage and grief, suddenly discovering that belief was wrong. His wolf did not growl or roar or snarl. It made a sound he had never heard it make before. A soft, low, aching whine, the sound of a wolf recognizing home. He left without letting Alara know he had been there. But that night, when he came to her room to check on her as he did every evening, he stayed longer than usual. He sat in the chair by the window while she sat on the bed, and they existed in a silence that was not uncomfortable, but companionable, the silence of two people who had both learned that words were not always necessary and not always trustworthy. She typed on her tablet, "Mira needs a home." He said, "I know." She typed, "She is like me." He said, "I know that too." She typed, "I want to give her what I never had." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Then we will." The "we" landed between them like a living thing, warm and heavy and full of implication, and Alara looked at him across the lamplight, and for the first time since the cellar, her wolf did not whisper mate, but something quieter, something closer to the way you say the word mine when you are saying it about something you have chosen, not something I was chosen for you. Celine struck 3 days later. The blow came not physically, but socially, which was far more dangerous in a pack. She organized a dinner, ostensibly in Alara's honor, inviting every high-ranking family in the territory. The invitation described it as a welcome celebration for the new Luna. In reality, it was an ambush. Alara arrived in a dress of soft silver that Kael had chosen for her dark hair pinned simply, her gray eyes calm. Kael walked beside her, his hand small of her back, and the warmth of his palm through the thin fabric was the only thing that kept her from turning around and walking back to her room. The dining hall was full. 50 wolves from the upper ranks seated at a long table gleaming with crystal and candlelight. Celine sat at the center, resplendent in red, and she rose when Alara entered and smiled with every tooth. "Our future Luna, please take your seat." The dinner began well enough. Food was served. Wine was poured. Conversation hummed. And then, between the second and third courses, Celine stood and tapped her glass. "I know we are all eager to know our future Luna better," she said, her voice carrying with practiced clarity. And I thought, what better way than to hear from her directly? "Alara, darling, would you like to say a few words? Perhaps tell us about your vision for the pack." The table went quiet. Every eye turned to Alara. She sat very still. The silver of her dress caught the candlelight, and her face, now fuller and healthier than it had been 4 weeks ago, was perfectly composed. But beneath the table, her hands were shaking. She could not speak. Everyone knew she could not speak. That was the point. The silence stretched. 1 second, 2, 5. The discomfort in the room sharpened into something edged, and Alara could see it happening, could see the doubt forming in the faces around the table, the quiet confirmation of what Celine wanted them to think. How can a mute Omega be Luna? How can she lead if she cannot speak? Kael's hand found hers under the table. He squeezed. She felt his wolf pressing against the bond between them, a warm, steady pulse that said, "I am here. I am here. I am here." But it was not Kael who saved the moment. A small voice cut through the silence like a bell. "Mama." Every head turned. In the doorway of the dining hall, standing in the nightgown with her dark curls tangled from sleep, Mira was staring across the room at Alara with huge gray eyes. She had escaped from the nursery. She had found her way through the palace corridors in the dark, following a scent, following the one person who had made the world feel safe again. Mama, Mira said again, clearer this time, and the word carried through the stunned silence of the dining hall with the force of a revelation, because this child had not spoken in 6 months, and the first word she chose to break her silence with was the name for the woman the entire table was trying to judge unworthy. Alara's composure broke. Not dramatically, not with sobs, but with a single tear that tracked down her cheek as she pushed back from the table and crossed the room and knelt on the stone floor and opened her arms. And Mira ran to her and crashed into her and wrapped her small arms around Alara's neck and said it again. Mama, 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 as if she had been saving the word for exactly this moment. The room was silent, but it was a different silence now. Not the cruel, expectant silence that Celine had engineered, but the awed, humbled silence of 50 wolves watching something they could not deny or diminish. Cale stood, his chair scraped back. He walked to where Alara knelt with Mira and crouched beside them, and his hand came to rest on the back of Alara's neck, and his wolf's growl was audible now, not a warning but a declaration, the sound of a wolf claiming its family in front of witnesses. He looked at Celine, just looked, and Celine, for all her poise, for all her calculation, could not hold his gaze. She sat down. He looked at the table. My mate does not need words to lead, he said. She leads with what she is, and what she is more than any of you deserve. He scooped Mira up with one arm, helped Alara to her feet with the other, and walked them both out of the dining hall without looking back. Behind them the silence held for a full 30 seconds before the whispers began, and this time the whispers were not about doubt. They were about the mute Omega who had made a silent child speak, about the Alpha King who knelt on a stone floor beside her, about the fact that, for the first time in anyone's memory, Cale Javon had looked at someone with an expression that was not cold, or commanding, or controlled, but raw and open and human. Celine sat in her red dress and felt the room shift beneath her, and she understood, with the precision of a chess player watching the board turn, that she was losing. She decided she could not afford to lose. What followed happened in the dark. Celine had maintained connections with certain members of the old border packs, wolves who had survived the wars Cale had fought to unify the territories and who held grudges like heirlooms. She contacted one of them, a beta named Harlan, whose brother Cale had killed in the final battle for the Ashford territory. The irony of an Ashford connection was not lost on her. The plan was simple. If the fated bond was the problem, eliminate the mate. Without Alara, Cale's wolf would destabilize. The council would need a strong Luna to anchor him. Celine would be there, ready, willing, and irreplaceable. She told Harlan when and where. She told him Alara's routine, the morning walks in the garden, the visits to the nursery, the evening moments alone when Cale was occupied with state affairs. She told him about Alara's muteness, her inability to scream for help. Make it look like an accident, she said. A fall, a rogue wolf, anything. Harlan agreed. Not because he cared about Celine's ambitions, but because hurting something that belonged to Cale Jervon was payment enough. It happened on a Tuesday. Alara was in the garden sitting on a stone bench with Mira on her lap, drawing wolves in a sketchbook. The autumn sun was thin and pale, and the air smelled of falling leaves and cold earth. Mira was humming, a tuneless little melody that she had begun producing in the days since she started speaking again, and Alara was listening to it with the focused attention of someone for whom every sound is precious, because she cannot make them herself. She did not hear Harlan approach. But her wolf did. The warning came as a white-hot pulse behind her ribs, so sudden and violent that she jerked upright, sending the sketchbook tumbling. Mira felt the change and went silent, clutching Alara's shirt. He came from the tree line, human form but barely. his features twisted with the partial shift of a wolf straining to emerge, his eyes yellow, his hands already clawed. He was fast. He covered the distance between the trees and a bench in 3 seconds. Alara did the only thing she could do. She stood, put Mira behind her, and faced him. She could not scream. She could not call for help. She could not even growl the way other wolves could to signal threat. She was silent, as she had always been silent, and the man coming toward her with claws extended was counting on that silence. But Alara's wolf was not silent. It rose inside her with a force she had never felt, a tidal wave of heat and light that crashed through the suppressions of years of starvation and abuse, and for the first time in her life, Alara felt the shift begin. Not a full transformation, her body was still too weak for that. But something happened to her eyes, something that made Harlan stumble and stop 3 feet from her. Her eyes blazed silver. Not gray. Silver, the bright, impossible, searing silver of a wolf that should not exist. A color that had not been seen in the 5 territories in over a century. A color that belonged to the old stories about the moon goddesses chosen, the wolves who carried the divine bond, the ones whose mate connections were not merely fated but sacred. Harlan stared, then he snarled and lunged. His claws caught Alara across the shoulder, tearing through fabric and skin, and pain exploded through her body. She fell back, twisting to keep Mira behind her, and blood bloomed hot and red across the silver dress, and Mira screamed, a high, piercing shriek that cut through the garden like a blade. 500 meters away in his study, Cale heard the scream. But he did not need to hear it. He had already felt the bond between them flare, with a pain that was not his own, a slashing, burning agony across his shoulder, and his wolf had not roared or snarled or growled. It had gone quiet, the dangerous kind of quiet, the kind of quiet that preceded the fall of entire packs 7 years ago. He shifted. The transformation was not the careful controlled process that most wolves employed. It was an explosion of force that shattered his desk and blew the study windows outward in a spray of glass. One moment, there was a man standing in an office. The next there was a wolf the size of a small horse, black as pitch, eyes burning gold, moving through the corridors of the palace at a speed that left claw marks in the stone floors and sent servants scrambling for the walls. He hit the garden doors at full sprint and did not slow down. The doors came off their hinges. The frame came with them. Harlan heard the impact and turned, and what he saw coming across the garden toward him was not a wolf king. It was death with golden eyes. It was the thing that other wolves saw in their nightmares. It was the reason the 5 territories had been unified under a single crown, because the creature crossing the distance between them was the single most lethal wolf that had existed in living memory, and it was moving with a purpose that left no room for mercy. Harlan ran. It did not matter. The black wolf hit him at full force, and the sound of the impact was something that the garden staff would remember for the rest of their lives, a wet, crunching sound followed by a howl of agony that cut off abruptly. Cale did not kill him. Later, Sarah would say this was the most impressive act of restraint she had ever witnessed from any wolf. He pinned Harlan to the ground with one massive paw on his chest and stood over him, jaws inches from his throat, dripping saliva that steamed in the cold air, and he did not bite down, because Alara needed him more. He shifted back, naked, crouched in the grass, splattered with someone else's blood. He went to her. She was on the ground, curled around Mira, her shoulder torn open and bleeding, her face white with pain, but she was conscious and Mira was untouched, and her wolf's silver eyes were still blazing as she looked up at him. He pulled her into his arms and pressed his face into her hair and breathed, and his body shook with the effort of not going back and finishing what he had started with Harlan. "I am here," he said. "I am here. I am here." Mira, sandwiched between them, patted Cal's face with a small, sticky hand and said, "Papa mad, despite everything, despite the blood and the terror and the feral edge still vibrating through his entire body." Cale made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Papa is very mad," he agreed. Harlan talked within the hour. Sarah had methods that were efficient and unpleasant, and a rogue wolf who had just attempted to murder the Alpha King's fated mate was not in a position to negotiate. He gave up Celine's name, her plan, and the details of every communication between them. Cale received this information while sitting beside Alara's bed in the medical wing, holding her hand while Dr. Hale stitched her shoulder. His expression did not change as Sarah delivered the report. His body did not move, but the temperature in the room dropped by several degrees, and the monitors on the wall flickered, and every wolf within the building felt the dominance flare like standing too close to a bonfire. "Bring Celine to the Grand Hall," he said. "Summon the pack." Sarah nodded. Then she hesitated. All of them, all of them. The Grand Hall filled for the second time in 2 months. But this time it was not for selection. This time it was for a reckoning. The pack knew something had happened. Rumors had spread like wildfire, carried by the garden staff who had seen the attack, by the servants who had watched the king shift in his study, by the guards who had dragged a broken, bleeding Harlan to the cells. The hall was tense, electric, every wolf on edge. Cale entered from the rear. He was dressed in black again, but this time he wore the crown, a simple circlet of dark iron that he never bothered with on ordinary occasions. It was a message. This was not a conversation. This was a judgment. Behind him, supported by Ronan and walking under her own power despite Dr. Daw. Hale's protests came Alara. Her shoulder was bandaged. Her face was pale, but her chin was up, and her gray eyes, still threaded with faint traces of impossible silver, swept the crowd with the quiet assessment of a woman who had survived worse than this and would survive whatever came next. And on her hip, because no one had been able to convince Mira to let go of her, was a 3-year-old with dark curls and a fierce grip, and the absolute certainty that the woman carrying her was her mother, regardless of what biology or pack law had to say about it. They took the platform. Kyle sat in the iron chair for the first time since his coronation. Alara stood beside him. He reached for her hand without looking, and she gave it without hesitation, and the bond between them hummed with something that every wolf in the room could feel, a warmth, a rightness, a frequency that resonated in the bones and said, "This is real. This is true. This is what a fated bond is supposed to feel like." "Bring her," Cale said. Celine was brought in. She was not in chains. She walked freely, her head high, her green eyes bright, still clinging to the belief that she could talk her way out of anything, because she always had. "Cale," she said, and her voice was smooth, concerned, warm. "I heard what happened. Think the goddess Alara is safe. When I find out who, you planned it," Cale said. The warmth in Celine's eyes flickered. "You contacted Harlan Cross. You provided him with Alara's schedule, her routines, her vulnerability. You paid him with a debt owed to the Croft Pack. You told him to make it look like an accident. He has confessed. We have the communications." Celine's smile held for 3 more seconds. It was impressive, really. The way a bridge holding under a possible weight is impressive in the moment before it collapses. "She is not fit to be Luna," Celine said, and her voice was no longer smooth but cracked and raw, the mask falling away to reveal the desperate, grasping ambition underneath. "She cannot speak, she cannot lead. She's an Omega, Cale, a damaged, voiceless Omega, and you are the Alpha King, and this pack deserves a Luna who would bleed to protect a child that is not her own," Cale said, and his voice was ice and iron. "This pack deserves a Luna whose first instinct when faced with death was to shield someone weaker. This pack deserves a Luna whose silence speaks louder than your words ever could." He stood. "Celine Croft, for the attempted murder of my fated mate and your future Luna, I strip you of rank, of pack membership, and of the protection of these territories. You are rogued." The word landed like a physical blow. Rogued, cast out, packless. In a world of wolves, it was the worst punishment short of death, a sentence of permanent exile, of being unmade from the pack bond, of becoming nothing. Celine's face went gray. "You cannot. My family, the Croftback Alliance, the Croftpack has been informed. Your father has accepted the judgment. He sends no objection." That was the blow that broke her. Not the sentence itself, but the knowledge that her own family would not fight for her, The same way Alara's family had not fought for Alara, the same way power structures always work, protecting themselves first and their members second. Celine crumpled. The guards caught her arms. She was led from the hall, and as she passed Alara, she looked up, and in her green eyes there was something that might have been hatred, or might have been envy, or might have been the terrible recognition of a woman seeing, for the first time, the difference between the love she had tried to manufacture and the love that had been freely given to someone she had tried to destroy. Alara watched her go. She did not look away. She held Mira close and stood beside her mate and watched until the doors closed, and then she looked up at Kale, and he looked down at her, and the bond between them burned gold and silver in the space between their heartbeats. He turned to the hall. Alara is my fated mate. She is your Luna. She carries the silver eyes of the moon goddess's chosen, a gift that has not appeared in this pack in over 100 years. She cannot speak with her voice, but she speaks with her courage, her compassion, and a strength that puts most of this hall to shame. He paused. Let the silence build. Then he spoke the words that every wolf in the room recognized, the ancient claiming declaration, the vow that bound Alpha to Omega in the sight of the pack and the moon. Before this pack and the moon that watches us, I claim this woman as my mate, my Luna, my equal. Her enemies are my enemies. Her blood is sacred. Her place is beside me, now and always. Any wolf who challenges her challenges me. Any wolf who harms her answers to my teeth. The hall responded, not with words, but with the instinctive, involuntary response of wolves, recognizing a true bond, a collective shudder of acceptance that moved through the crowd like wind through grass. One by one, beginning with Ronan and Sarah and spreading outward through the ranks, the wolves in the hall lowered their heads, not bowing, acknowledging, accepting, submitting to the Luna. Alara felt it happen. She felt the pack bond open like a door inside her chest, hundreds of threads suddenly connecting her to the wolves in the room, a web of warmth and loyalty and belonging that flooded through her starved, hollow places and filled them completely. Her wolf howled inside her, not with sound, but with light, silver light that blazed behind her eyes and made the candles in the hall flicker and dance. She lifted her free hand, the one not holding Mira, and placed it over her heart. Then she extended it toward the hall, palm open. I receive you. I hold you. I am yours. It was enough. It was more than enough. Kale looked at her with the expression of a man watching the impossible happen and deciding to believe in it. He leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead, and his wolf's rumble resonated through both their bodies. And Mira patted his face again and said quite clearly, Papa kissed Mama. In the hall, this solemn, dignified, formal hall, full of the most powerful wolves in 5 territories, laughed. The trial of Margot and Vivian Ashford took place 4 days after the claiming ceremony, and it was swift and merciless. The evidence was overwhelming. Pack investigators had found the cellar, the chain still bolted to the wall, the iron ring stained with old blood. They found the falsified death certificate. They found financial records showing that Margot had claimed Alara's inheritance from her father, a substantial sum, and spent it on the manor and Vivian's education and wardrobe. They found letters written in Margot's hand to the pack doctor who had falsely classified Alara as rankless, detailing the payment for his cooperation. Margot attempted to defend herself. She spoke of Alara's muteness as a burden, of the difficulty of raising a disabled child, of the expenses involved. She spoke as if she expected sympathy. She did not find it. Kale sat on the judgment seat and listened with the patience of a predator waiting for its prey to finish running. When Margot finally stopped talking, he spoke. You chained a child in darkness. You starved her. You broke her ribs. You stole her inheritance, her identity, and her right to exist in her own pack. You did this not because she was a burden, but because she was an obstacle. Her father's money was easier to access without a living heir. Her presence was a complication you preferred to eliminate. Margot's face twisted. She is an Omega, a mute. She was never going to amount to. She is the Luna of the 5 territories. She carries the moon goddess's silver. She is more than you could have imagined, and you buried her alive. The sentence was exile for Margot. Stripped of rank, assets, pack membership. The Ashford estate was seized, and its proceeds allocated to a fund for abused Omegas that Alara herself had proposed through a written petition to the council, the first official act of her position as Luna, and the council had approved it unanimously because no one was going to say no to the woman whose mate had recently torn a man apart with his bare hands in a garden. Vivienne received a lesser sentence, exile from the territory but retention of her pack bond, on the condition that she complete 5 years of service in an Omega rehabilitation center. It was Alara who had requested the leniency. When Kale had questioned her, she had typed on her tablet, she was cruel because she was taught cruelty. Punishment should teach something different. He had looked at her for a long time after reading that. You are better than I am, he had said. She had typed, I have had more practice at Mercy. The weeks after the claiming were strange and tender, and full of small discoveries. Kale discovered that Alara was ticklish on the backs of her knees, a fact he uncovered accidentally while helping Dr. Hale with the physical therapy exercise and exploited shamelessly afterward because the silent laughter that overtook her body when he found the spot, shoulders shaking, face scrunched, mouth open in soundless hilarity, was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Alara discovered that Kale talked in his sleep. Not coherently, just fragments, but sometimes he said her name. And the way he said it in sleep was different from the way he said it awake, softer, less guarded, as if the walls he maintained during daylight hours dissolved when he was unconscious, and the man underneath was gentler than the king would ever admit. They discovered Mira together. The adoption was formalized 3 weeks after the claiming, and on the night the papers were signed, Kyle carried Mira to bed and told her a story about a brave wolf princess who could not roar, but who saved her pack by being cleverer than every wolf who could. Mira fell asleep with her fist wrapped around his finger, and Kyle did not move for 2 hours, sitting on the floor beside her small bed, because he was afraid that if he moved she would wake and she had only just started sleeping through the night. Alara found him there. She stood in the doorway and watched him. This enormous, terrifying man sitting cross-legged on the floor of a child's room with a stuffed rabbit wedged between his knee and the bed frame. And she felt the bond between them flare with something that was beyond attraction, beyond gratitude, beyond even love. It was recognition, the knowledge that this was the person she had been running toward in every dream, through every silver forest, in every moment of dark and cold and silence. She crossed the room. She knelt beside him. She took his face in both hands and kissed him. It was their first kiss. It was silent in a way everything between them was silent, but it was not empty. It was a conversation conducted entirely in pressure and warmth and the faint tremor of his jaw under her palms. His hands came up to her waist and held her, as if she were made of something precious and breakable, and his wolf made that sound again, the low aching whine, the sound of coming home. When they separated, his forehead rested against hers, and his breath was unsteady, and the gold in his eyes was so bright she could see herself reflected in it. I did not think I would feel this again, he whispered. I did not think I was capable. She placed her hand over his heart. His heartbeat hammered against her palm. She pressed once. I know. He covered her hand with his. Stay, she nodded. They stayed there, on the floor of Mira's room, until the child stirred at dawn and found them asleep against each other, and said, with the devastating clarity of a 3-year-old, Mama and Papa had a sleepover. And Kale laughed, and the sound of it echoed through the hallway, and the guards on duty exchanged startled glances because none of them had ever heard the king laugh. Spring came to Blackmore, and with it, change. The Omega Protection Act, drafted by Alara and formalized by the council, was implemented across all 5 territories. It mandated regular census verification for all registered Omegas, criminalized the falsification of death records, established independent medical review for Omega Health classifications, and created a network of safe houses funded by seized assets from convicted abusers. Alara could not speak to advocate for the law, but she wrote a letter that was read aloud to the council by Ronan, and the letter was so precise and so devastating and so unflinching in its description of what she had survived that 3 council members wept, and the vote was unanimous. The pack adapted to its silent Luna in ways no one had predicted. Sign language courses were offered at the Pack Academy. The palace staff learned basic signs within a month. The children at the nursery, led by Mira, became the most fluent signers in the territory, their small hands flying through conversations with Alara at a speed that left adult learners embarrassed. And the pack discovered something else, something that the old stories had hinted at but that no living wolf had seen. Alara's silver eyes were not merely cosmetic. The moon goddess's chosen carried a gift, a connection to the pack bond that was deeper and more intimate than any Luna in recorded history. Alara could feel every wolf in the pack. Not their thoughts, but their emotions, their distress, their joy. She knew when a wolf on the border was injured before the report came in. She knew when the nursery children were upset. She knew one morning in early spring that something had changed inside her own body before any test could confirm it. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands to her stomach and felt the bond hum with a new frequency. Tiny and rapid and fierce. A heartbeat that was not hers and not Kale's, but something they had made together, and her wolf blazed silver in the dawn light. She did not tell Kale immediately. She wanted to find the right way, a way that matched the magnitude of what she felt, a way that a voiceless woman could communicate the most important words she would ever not say. She told Mira first. She knelt in front of their daughter and signed slowly, carefully, "You are going to be a big sister." Mira's eyes went wide, then her face split into a grin of such incandescent joy that it hurt to look at directly. That evening, Kale came to their chamber after a long day of territorial negotiations, tired and tense, the gold in his eyes dim with exhaustion. Mira was sitting on the bed, vibrating with barely contained excitement. Alara stood by the window, backlit by the last light of the spring sun, and she was smiling, and the smile was so different from the careful, guarded expressions he was used to that he stopped in the doorway. "What?" he said. Mira could not contain herself any longer. She launched off the bed, ran to Kale, grabbed both his hands, and said, with the volume and clarity of a child delivering the most important announcement in the history of the world, "Papa, Mama has a baby in her tummy." Kale went completely still. He looked at Mira. He looked at Alara. He looked at Alara's hands, which were resting on her stomach. He looked at her eyes, which were bright with tears and silver light and something that needed no translation. He crossed the room in 3 steps. His hands replaced hers on her stomach, and they were shaking again, the way they had shaken in the cellar, the way they shook every time something happened, that his carefully constructed walls were not designed to withstand. "Ilara," he said, and his voice cracked on her name, and his wolf howled inside him, not with grief this time, but with something that was the exact opposite of grief, something that had no word in any language but that every parent recognizes, the ferocious, terrified, all-consuming joy of new life. She put her hands over his and held them against the place where their child was growing, and the bond between them sang, gold and silver woven together, and the sound of it was audible only to them and to the small life between her palms, and it sounded like a promise. The pack knew by morning, not because anyone told them. They felt it through the Luna bond, the new frequency, the tiny rapid heartbeat woven into the web that connected every wolf in the territory. Congratulations arrived in waves. Ronan brought a case of the king's favorite whiskey and a stuffed wolf for the baby. Sarah brought a set of hand-forged silver training blades, because Sarah's idea of a baby gift was always practical. Dr. Hale brought a comprehensive prenatal care plan and a mild sedative for the king, in case the king's hovering became medically inadvisable for the Luna's blood pressure. The hovering was, by all accounts, extraordinary. Kyle, who had conquered 5 territories and stared down hostile alpha delegations without blinking, became visibly anxious if Alara walked downstairs without holding a railing. He rearranged his entire schedule to be present for every meal, every medical check, every moment that might possibly require his immediate intervention. Ronan gently suggested that the king was perhaps being slightly overprotective. Kale looked at him with an expression that suggested Ronan's next words should be chosen very, very carefully. Alara handled it with the patience of a woman who had survived much worse things than an attentive mate. She let him carry her when he needed to carry her. She let him growl at anyone who came too close when his wolf was particularly agitated. She drew the line at the armed guard he tried to station inside the bathroom, communicating her refusal through a look so eloquent that Kale removed the guard without further discussion. But at night, when they lay together in the dark, his hand on her growing stomach, his face buried in her hair, she felt the truth of his fear. Not the irrational, overblown anxiety of the daytime performance, but the real deep, grinding terror of a man who had already lost everything once and could not survive losing it again. She would turn in his arms and cup his face and press her forehead to his, and the bond between them would pulse with the message she sent him every night, wordless and clear. I am here. I am not leaving. We are safe. And his wolf would settle, and his breathing would slow, and he would sleep. On a morning in late autumn, with the leaves turning gold and the air crisp with the promise of the first frost, Alara stood at the window of the Luna's chamber and looked out over the Blackmore Valley. She could see the packed compound below, wolves going about their day, children playing in the courtyards, smoke rising from the kitchens. She could feel them all through the bond. Hundreds of lives humming with the ordinary, extraordinary business of existing. Behind her, Mira was drawing at the table, her tongue poking out in concentration, creating a picture of a wolf family that included 2 large wolves, 1 small wolf, and 1 very small wolf that was mostly a circle with legs which she explained was the baby. In the doorway, Kale leaned against the frame and watched them both with eyes that were gold only at the edges now, the rest having faded to a warm, deep brown that Alara had never seen before she came into his life. His wolf was calm, not dormant, not feral, but present and steady, anchored by the bond and the mate and the child and the life they had built in the space where grief had been. Alara touched the glass. The cold bit her fingertips. She remembered another kind of cold. The stone floor of a cellar, the iron around her wrists, the darkness that she had thought was permanent. She remembered Margot's voice telling her she would never be seen. She remembered Vivian's photo, the casual cruelty of documenting suffering for entertainment. She remembered the silence, not her silence, which was her own and which he had learned to wear like armor, but the other silence, the silence of a world that had decided she did not exist. She was not that girl anymore. She was Luna of the 5 territories. She was mate to the Alpha King. She was mother to a dark-haired girl who drew wolf families and spoke in sentences that started with, Mama says, even though Mama had never spoken a word. She was carrying a child whose heartbeat she could feel through a bond that connected her to every wolf under her protection. She was the architect of laws that would prevent other Omegas from enduring what she had endured. She was the silver-eyed woman who had walked out of the darkness and into the light, and the light had not burned her. It had welcomed her. Kale crossed the room and stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her from behind, his hands settling on her stomach where their child kicked against his palms with enthusiastic regularity. He pressed his lips to the side of her neck, to the mark he had placed there on their mating night, the permanent seal of the bond that tied them together in a way that transcended language and voice and every limitation the world had tried to impose on her. What are you thinking? He murmured against her skin. She leaned back into him. She took his hand and placed it over her heart. She pressed once. You. He smiled against her neck. She felt it. I am thinking about you too, he said. Mira looked up from her drawing. I am thinking about lunch, she announced. Kale laughed. Alara's shoulders shook with soundless laughter, and the morning continued, ordinary and extraordinary, quiet and full the way all the best mornings are. Somewhere in the valley below, a wolf howled. Not in warning or grief or challenge, just howling the way wolves do, because the sky is wide and the pack is near, and the world, for all its cruelty, contains moments of such unexpected, undeserved grace that the only possible response is to throw back your head and sing. Alara could not howl. She had never been able to howl. But she closed her eyes and felt it through the bond, the wild, wordless joy of it, and her wolf blazed silver inside her chest, and she let the feeling fill her, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything she had spent her whole life running toward in the dark. And she had finally arrived.